I was 34 when I started believing that stability was the same thing as happiness. I worked as a project manager for a mid-size logistics company in Houston, the kind of job built on deadlines, spreadsheets, and predictable outcomes. I liked knowing what tomorrow would look like. I woke up at 6:10 every morning, brewed the same dark coffee, checked overnight emails, and left the house by 7:05. Order felt like control, and control felt like safety. Our house reflected that mindset. A quiet neighborhood, trimmed lawns, neutral paint. Nothing extravagant, nothing alarming. Just enough to say we were doing fine. I had bought it 2 years after marrying Emily, back when we still talked about building something together as if it were a shared project rather than a slogan. At the time, it felt earned. Emily and I had been married for 6 years. We didn't fight much, which I used to see as proof of compatibility. Looking back, it was more like efficient coexistence. We divided responsibilities cleanly. Bills were mine, social planning was hers. We checked in on each other's days, but mostly out of habit. Dinner together most nights. A show before bed. Phones face down, or so I thought. Emily worked in marketing, ambitious and sharp. When she got promoted to senior account lead, I was genuinely proud. Her boss had personally recommended her, fast-tracked her into bigger clients, bigger budgets. She started dressing sharper, carrying herself differently. I framed it as growth. We celebrated with wine and takeout, and I remember saying, "This is good for us." She smiled and agreed. Her schedule changed after that. Later evenings. Occasional weekend calls. Business dinners that ran long. None of it felt suspicious in isolation. I told myself this was what success looked like, sacrifice now, comfort later. When friends joked about her living at the office, I defended her without hesitation. I wanted to be the supportive husband, not the insecure one. There were small things, though. Details that didn't fit cleanly but weren't sharp enough to cut. She stopped asking about my day with the same curiosity. Her phone never left her side, even at home. She started showering the moment she walked in, saying it helped her decompress. When I reached for her at night, she was often tired, already halfway asleep. I noticed, but I explained it away. Stress. Pressure. Temporary imbalance. That's what marriages went through, I told myself. Phases. I had read enough articles to feel informed without being alert. I believed trust meant not counting inconsistencies. We still did the normal things. Grocery runs on Sundays. Family dinners twice a month. Laughing at the same jokes we'd been repeating for years. From the outside, nothing looked broken. Even from the inside, it felt intact. Not exciting, but intact. Like a machine that hummed reliably as long as you didn't open the casing. One Friday evening, Emily came home earlier than expected. She looked relaxed, lighter somehow. She kissed me on the cheek and said her meeting had been cancelled. We ordered pizza, opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving, and sat on the couch talking about nothing important. She rested her head on my shoulder like she used to. At one point, she said, "I'm really glad we're steady. You know that, right?" I nodded without hesitation. It felt true. In that moment, everything did. The first crack didn't announce itself as betrayal. It arrived dressed as coincidence, the kind you only notice because something about it refuses to settle. It happened on a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way. I got home around 7, later than usual, traffic snarled by an accident on I-10. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. Emily wasn't home yet, which wasn't unusual anymore. I reheated leftovers, ate standing at the counter, and checked my phone. No message from her. No missed call. I told myself not to read into it. She came in close to 9, moving quietly, like she didn't want to disturb the air. Her coat was still on when she walked past me toward the bedroom. "Long day?" I asked. She paused, turned, and smiled. "Productive day," she said. Dinner with the client ran longer than planned. I nodded. Client dinners had become a regular feature of our lives. I asked which client, mostly out of politeness. She hesitated. Just a beat. Then she named one I'd heard before. "Good outcome?" I asked. "Very," she said, already halfway down the hall. It should have ended there. Instead, later that night, while she was showering, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't trying to snoop. It was just there, screen lighting up the room. A calendar reminder preview flashed briefly before fading. Dinner moved. Confirmed. No name. No company. Just that. I felt a flicker of discomfort. Sharp but fleeting. Calendar notes were often vague. Mine were. Still, I caught myself wondering why a dinner that had run long needed to be moved at all. I told myself I was overthinking it. Stress makes patterns out of nothing. I put the phone face down and walked away. The next morning, Emily mentioned she'd need the car that weekend. A last-minute strategy session, possibly overnight. I thought weekends were off-limits now, I said, smiling to soften it. She smiled back, calm, unbothered. Normally, yes. But this is important. You know how it is. I did know how it was. Or at least, I knew how it was supposed to be. Ambition doesn't ask permission. I said it was fine and meant it. Mostly. What unsettled me wasn't the request. It was how little space there was for discussion. Not dismissal, something subtler. As if the decision had already been finalized somewhere else, and I was being informed as a courtesy. That night, I asked her if everything at work was okay. I framed it carefully, neutrally. Of course, she said. Why wouldn't it be? No reason, I replied. You just seem busy. She laughed softly. I'm finally where I've been working toward for years. Busy is part of it. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No irritation. Just confidence. It made my concern feel misplaced, almost embarrassing. I apologized for bringing it up. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're allowed to worry, she said. But you don't need to. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made something inside me go quiet. Over the next few days, I started noticing how often I edited myself. Questions swallowed before they reached my mouth. Thoughts reframed into something less accusatory, less needy. I didn't want to be the husband who projected insecurity onto his wife's success. I had seen that dynamic before, and I despised it. So when she missed our standing Thursday dinner with friends and texted an hour later saying she'd lost track of time, I replied with a thumbs up. When she took a call outside and didn't come back for 20 minutes, I turned up the TV. When she said she was exhausted and went straight to bed, I cleaned the kitchen alone. None of it proved anything. That was the problem. Every piece, on its own, was harmless. Explainable. Reasonable. Together, they formed a shape I refused to name. One night, lying beside her as she slept, I stared at the ceiling and considered asking the question directly. Not accusing. Just asking. I rehearsed the sentence in my head, trimmed it of edge, made it safe. Then I imagined her expression, surprised, wounded, disappointed. I turned onto my side instead. Silence felt easier than doubt. The shift didn't come with confrontation. It came quietly, through a detail that wasn't meant for me at all. A week after Emily's supposed overnight strategy session, I stopped by her office building to drop off her laptop charger. She'd forgotten it at home, and I told myself it was a simple courtesy. The kind of thing supportive spouses did. I didn't text her beforehand. I wanted it to be a small, thoughtful surprise. The lobby was nearly empty when I arrived. Late afternoon lull. I gave my name to the receptionist and explained why I was there. She smiled politely, typed something into her computer, then frowned slightly. She's not scheduled in today, she said. At least not on site. I felt a brief flash of embarrassment. Oh. She mentioned a strategy session. The receptionist nodded, already disengaging. Some meetings are off calendar. You can leave it with me. I handed over the charger and left, telling myself this meant nothing. Off-site meetings existed. Flexible schedules existed. But the word overnight replayed in my head as I walked back to the car. I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. That night, I didn't mention the visit. Emily came home late again, relaxed, humming softly as she set her bag down. She talked about deadlines and deliverables, nothing specific, nothing false enough to challenge. I listened, nodded, and felt something unfamiliar tighten in my chest. After that, I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I started listening differently. I paid attention to timelines. To the way stories shifted subtly depending on when they were told. A dinner that had been with the team became with the client a few days later. A late meeting overlapped with an event I knew had ended earlier. Not lies, just misalignments. The kind that suggested parallel narratives rather than deception. One evening, while sorting through mail, I found an envelope addressed to Emily from a medical clinic. No logo I recognized. Just her name and our address. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The return address alone was enough to spike my pulse. She took the envelope from my hand without comment, slid it into her bag, and said, "Just paperwork." I nodded. "Okay." Later, I told myself I should have asked what kind of paperwork arrived without notice. I told myself a lot of things. My trust didn't vanish. It fractured. I still believed her, but I also believed the inconsistencies. Holding both at once was exhausting. I began replaying conversations from the past year, searching for patterns I hadn't noticed before. Not proof, context. At work, I found myself distracted, rereading emails, missing details I normally caught instantly. At night, sleep came shallow and broken. I would wake to the sound of her phone vibrating, only to realize it hadn't. Anxiety has a way of inventing stimuli when fed uncertainty. I checked our shared calendar one morning and noticed entries that had been deleted. Not replaced. Just gone. I told myself that happened all the time. People rescheduled. Cleaned up clutter. Still, I took a screenshot before closing the app. I didn't know why. I just did. The breaking point came accidentally. A timing error so small it would have meant nothing to anyone else. Emily mentioned she'd met her boss briefly that afternoon to finalize quarterly projections. Casual. Offhand. Later that night, while scrolling through a local news site, I saw a photo from a charity gala held across town, an event her company sponsored. Her boss was there. Front and center. Time-stamped 2 hours earlier. I stared at the image longer than I needed to. It wasn't incriminating. He was allowed to be there. She hadn't said she wasn't. But she had said she met him that afternoon. I closed the browser and sat in the dark, the room suddenly too quiet. The feeling that settled over me wasn't anger. It was disorientation. Like realizing the floor plan of your own house had changed overnight. There was no single truth yet. Just overlapping versions of reality that could no longer coexist. And for the first time, I understood something I couldn't undo. If I kept asking the wrong questions, I would never hear the right answers. I chose my moment carefully. Not when I was angry, not when the house felt tense. I waited for a Sunday morning, when light filled the kitchen and routine softened everything. Emily was drinking coffee, scrolling through her phone, hair still damp from the shower. Normal. Disarming. "I stopped by your office last week," I said, casually, as if it had just occurred to me. "You left your charger at home." She looked up, surprised, but only briefly. "Oh. You didn't tell me." "I figured I'd just drop it off." A pause. Measured. "That was nice of you." "They said you weren't scheduled on site that day." There it was. I kept my voice even, curious rather than pointed. I watched her closely, not for guilt, but for calculation. "Yes," she said easily. "I had meetings elsewhere. I thought I mentioned that." She hadn't. But I didn't say so. "I guess I assumed you were in the building," I replied. "Since you said it was an all-day session." She shrugged lightly. Plans change. The conversation could have ended there. She returned to her phone, confident in the answer she'd provided. I felt something twist, not suspicion, but the awareness that she had closed a door without slamming it. Cleanly. Politely. Later that evening, I tried again. Different angle. "You've been seeing your boss a lot lately," I said while we cooked dinner. "More than usual." She didn't look at me this time. Focused on the cutting board. "He's my boss. That's not unusual." "I know," I said. "I just meant outside the office too." She smiled then. Calm, almost indulgent. "Are you worried about something?" The question wasn't defensive. It was diagnostic. "No," I said quickly. "Just adjusting." She nodded, as if that made sense. This role comes with visibility. Dinners, events, travel. It's part of the package. "So the gala last week?" I asked. "That was work too?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Company sponsored." "You didn't mention going." "I didn't think it mattered." That was the pattern. Not denial, reduction. Not lies, selective framing. Every answer was technically sufficient, emotionally incomplete. She gave me just enough to sound reasonable, never enough to invite follow-up. I realized then that she wasn't reacting to my questions. She was managing them. The more neutral I stayed, the smoother she became. When I pressed lightly, she widened the frame. When I narrowed it, she softened the edges. She never contradicted herself outright. She didn't need to. She controlled the narrative by deciding which parts were relevant. At one point, she reached out and touched my arm. "You know I wouldn't risk what we have," she said. "Not for anything." It sounded sincere. Practiced, maybe, but convincing. I wanted to believe her. Or maybe I wanted to believe that belief itself was still possible. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the conversation in my head. Not what she said, but how she said it. The confidence. The lack of urgency. The absence of fear. This wasn't someone caught off guard. This was someone accustomed to steering outcomes. And I understood something unsettling. I wasn't ahead of the truth. I was behind it. She knew what I knew, or at least what I didn't. Every question I asked revealed my position. Every calm answer kept her secure. By trying to avoid accusation, I had handed her control. I turned toward her, watching her breathe evenly in the dark. I thought about asking one more question. Something direct. Something that would force a real response. Instead, I stayed silent. Not because I was convinced. Because I knew, now, that I was playing a game I hadn't agreed to, and I was losing it without ever seeing the full board. Equals 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 equals. The proof didn't arrive dramatically. No confession, no confrontation caught on a glowing screen at midnight. It came the way real damage often does, through paperwork. I was reviewing our shared finances one Thursday evening, something I did once a month out of habit. Mortgage, utilities, savings. Predictable. That night, one charge didn't belong. A private medical clinic. Not our primary provider. Not in our insurance network. The amount wasn't outrageous. That was what made it dangerous. Large enough to notice, small enough to ignore. I stared at the statement longer than necessary, hoping context would materialize on its own. It didn't. I logged into the insurance portal. No matching claim. No explanation. I didn't ask Emily about it. Not yet. Instead, I started building a timeline. Calendar entries. Bank records. Travel dates. Work events. I didn't rush. I treated it like a work project, methodical, detached. The more I aligned the data, the clearer the pattern became. Late meetings matched hotel charges. Strategy sessions overlapped with unexplained withdrawals. The overnight weekend aligned precisely with the clinic visit. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't recent. It had been running parallel to our life for months, possibly longer. The final piece came from a message that wasn't meant for me. Emily left her tablet on the kitchen counter while she showered. A notification lit up the screen, an email preview from her boss's assistant. Subject line, updated arrangements, discretion confirmed. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The language alone confirmed what my mind had been refusing to assemble. That night, I asked her directly about the clinic charge. No accusation. Just a fact. She didn't pretend not to understand. Yes, she said calmly. I meant to tell you. When? I asked. When it was relevant. There was no denial left to offer. Instead, she explained. Carefully. Strategically. She talked about pressure. About power dynamics. About how complicated things became when professional advancement and personal boundaries blurred. She framed it as something that happened to her, not something she chose repeatedly. It wasn't serious, she said. Not like you're thinking. I asked how long. She hesitated. Then gave a number smaller than the truth I already knew. And the clinic? I asked. She exhaled slowly. Precaution. The word landed wrong. Too controlled. Too rehearsed. As she spoke, something else became clear. This wasn't damage control. This was expectation management. She wasn't afraid I'd leave. She was explaining why I shouldn't. She talked about our mortgage. Our families. The optics of divorce. Her career trajectory. She talked about how people would interpret things if they ever became public. How messy it would be. You're steady, she said. You understand consequences. That was when it hit me. She hadn't hidden this hoping I'd never find out. She'd hidden it until it could be presented as manageable. Until the cost of leaving outweighed the insult of staying. Until compliance looked like maturity. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was logistical. Planned. Calculated. I realized I wasn't being asked for forgiveness. I was being asked for cooperation. The room felt smaller as she spoke, like the walls had shifted inward without making a sound. I saw our marriage clearly for the first time, not as partnership, but as infrastructure. Something stable enough to absorb impact without collapsing. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I listened until she finished. Then I stood up. Nothing she could say after that mattered. The life I thought I was protecting no longer existed. This wasn't a crossroads. It was the end of one road entirely. Emily didn't press for an answer that night. She didn't need to. The trap worked better if it closed slowly. Over the next few days, her explanations evolved. Not contradicted, expanded. Each conversation added another layer of reason, another frame in which staying became not just preferable, but responsible. She talked about context. About how power dynamics blurred consent without erasing intent. About how her boss had influence she couldn't simply reject without consequence. She never called it an affair. She called it a situation. Something unfortunate, contained, already ending. "I handled it," she said more than once. "I'm handling it." What she meant was that the mess had been stabilized. Damage minimized. Variables controlled. Then came expectation. "We don't need to destroy everything," she said one evening, her voice low, almost gentle. "We can move forward like adults." Move forward meant silence. Discretion. Not asking questions that forced visible answers. She framed it as protection. Of me. Of us. Her mother called 2 days later. Casual at first. Small talk. Then concern, delicately introduced. "Emily seems stressed," she said. "You know how much pressure she's under right now. She needs support." Support. The word carried weight. Implicit instruction. Friends noticed tension and offered unsolicited wisdom. Every marriage hits a rough patch. Don't throw away years over one mistake. Someone said, "You don't want to be that guy who couldn't handle his wife's success." I understood then how isolation worked, not by cutting you off, but by surrounding you with voices that all pointed in the same direction. Emily never told me directly what she expected. She didn't have to. The expectation was embedded in the logic: real men endure, real partners protect the shared future, real adults don't detonate their lives over pride. If I refused, I wasn't betrayed, I was unreasonable. That framing gnawed at me. Not because I believed it, but because I recognized how easily it could become public truth. At night, anger burned hot and useless. During the day, it cooled into something sharper. I thought about who I was before this. The rules I lived by. The line between resilience and self-erasure. Responsibility had always meant consistency to me. Showing up. Carrying weight. But no one had ever defined whether responsibility included absorbing another person's deception for the sake of appearances. If I stayed, I would be complicit, in the lie, in the silence, in the rewriting of events. If I left, I would become the disruption. The variable. The one who couldn't let it go. That was the trap. Both choices carried moral cost. Only one preserved the structure that benefited everyone else. Emily watched me closely during this period, mistaking restraint for surrender. She spoke about future plans again. Vacations postponed. Career milestones ahead. She behaved as if the decision had already been made, and time would simply catch up. I let her believe that. Not because I had accepted anything, but because I needed space to think without pressure. To understand leverage. To see what truth cost when removed from theory and placed inside real lives. Silence, I learned, could be strategic. I told her I needed time. She agreed easily. Too easily. That confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about whether I would step fully into a role I had never consented to play, and call it responsibility once the door closed behind me. Equals 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 equals. I stopped talking about it. That was the first change Emily noticed, and the one she misunderstood most. No more questions. No late-night silences charged with tension. No revisiting timelines or explanations. I listened when she spoke, nodded when appropriate, and returned to routine with a precision that felt almost comforting. To her, it looked like acceptance. To me, it was distance. I began documenting quietly. Nothing dramatic. Screenshots saved to a folder disguised among work files. Bank statements downloaded monthly instead of reviewed online. Calendar exports archived. I requested a full credit report and froze nothing, yet. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. At work, I took longer lunches and used the time to consult an attorney whose name I had been given years earlier, after a colleague's divorce. I didn't say my wife's name. I didn't need to. I asked procedural questions. What silence meant legally? What cooperation implied? What documentation mattered? Assume everything becomes visible, the attorney said. Act accordingly. That became my rule. At home, I was careful. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I didn't provoke suspicion. I let Emily talk about her day, about work transitions, about stress she claimed was finally easing. She spoke freely now, unburdened by the need to convince. She believed the crisis had passed. Once, she said, "I appreciate how mature you're being about all this." I smiled and said nothing. Emotionally, something had shut down. Not rage, clarity. I stopped imagining outcomes that included repair. I stopped asking what I wanted and focused instead on what was necessary. The version of myself that still felt wounded was set aside, like a file no longer needed for the current task. I set boundaries without naming them. Separate accounts for discretionary spending. A change to how shared passwords were stored. A backup of personal data saved off-site. Each move was small, defensible on its own. Together, they formed a perimeter. Emily didn't notice. Or she noticed and interpreted it as pragmatism. She grew lighter. More affectionate. She talked about the future again as if it were settled territory. I let her believe that too. Hope, I learned, makes people careless. At night, lying beside her, I no longer searched her breathing for meaning. I slept. When I woke, I didn't replay conversations. I reviewed checklists. There was no urgency. That was important. Rushed decisions look like reactions. Reactions invite narratives you don't control. I waited. The waiting wasn't passive. It was deliberate. I needed alignment, documents in order, timing clean, exposure minimized. Not to protect her. To protect myself. The calm unsettled even me at times. I wondered briefly if this was what forgiveness felt like. Then I reviewed the evidence again and felt nothing but resolve. This wasn't reconciliation. It was staging. And while Emily mistook my silence for compliance, I understood something she didn't. Decisions made quietly are harder to undo, and impossible to intercept once they're set in motion. Equals 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 equals. The disclosure happened in daylight, without raised voices or locked doors. That was intentional. Lies survive best in private. Emily's company hosted a quarterly review at a downtown conference center. Executives, department heads, a few spouses invited for the closing reception. Neutral ground. Professional. Documented. I attended because attendance was expected. Because absence would have asked questions I didn't want asked yet. I waited until the final session ended and the room thinned into smaller conversations. Emily stood with her boss near the windows, relaxed, confident, already narrating the future. I approached when there were witnesses close enough to hear, far enough not to interrupt. "I need a moment," I said. Calm. Polite. Her boss looked surprised but nodded. Emily's expression tightened, just slightly. I handed him a folder. No speech. No accusation. Just paper. Inside were timelines, financial records, and a copy of the clinic invoice, highlighted, dated, cross-referenced. Not commentary. Facts. Enough to establish overlap, discretion, and misuse of company resources. Enough to require explanation. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. "I'm here to correct the record." That was all. He flipped through the pages, slower than necessary. His face changed, not to panic, but to calculation. Emily started to speak. "I'm finished," I said. "You'll want to read it all." There was nothing she could reframe in that moment. No private context. No softened language. The narrative didn't belong to her anymore, it belonged to the documents. A compliance officer joined within minutes. Then HR. The setting did the work for me. Process replaced persuasion. Emily tried to regain footing later, pulling me aside near the elevators. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Not angry. Strained. "I didn't," I replied. "I chose to." Her usual calm was gone. Without privacy, without control, she was just another person facing consequences. The imbalance she'd managed so carefully evaporated in real time. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. Accountability doesn't require an audience. I left the building, stepped into the street, and felt something loosen in my chest, not relief, exactly. Alignment. Over the next days, the outcomes unfolded without my involvement. Internal investigation. Administrative leave. A quiet announcement framed in neutral language. No names, no scandal headlines. Just the machinery of consequence doing what it was designed to do when given facts instead of stories. Emily called once. Then again. I didn't answer. When we finally spoke, days later, it was brief. "You humiliated me," she said. "No," I replied. "I documented reality." She had no response to that. I wasn't interested in punishment. I didn't need an apology. What I needed was clarity, externally and internally. A clean line between what was true and what had been managed into something tolerable. The exposure wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Truth, placed in the right room, speaks for itself. Truth doesn't end things cleanly. It widens them. It touches people who never asked to be involved and leaves marks where certainty used to be. The fallout moved faster than I expected. Emily was placed on indefinite leave, her name quietly removed from projects she'd spent years building. Her boss resigned within a week, officially for personal reasons. The company released a brief statement about internal review and policy reinforcement. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just consequences moving through channels designed to absorb them without noise. Friends noticed before I told them. Invitations slowed. Conversations shifted. People didn't know where to place me in the story, and uncertainty makes most people cautious. Some reached out privately, offering support that felt more like distance with good intentions. Others avoided the subject entirely. Emily moved out within a month. Not after a fight. After a meeting with lawyers and a list of logistics neither of us pretended were temporary. The house felt hollow afterward, not painful, exactly, just emptied of purpose. I realized how much of our life had been built around maintenance rather than meaning. She tried, once, to explain everything again. Without the leverage of her career or the confidence of control, the language changed. Power dynamics became excuses. Pressure became justification. The narrative that once positioned her as a victim of circumstance collapsed under the weight of consequence. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said. That was the truth she hadn't faced until then. Neither of us won. That became clear quickly. I lost a future I'd planned for years without realizing how conditional it had been. I lost routines, assumptions, and the version of myself that believed trust eroded slowly enough to be repaired. There were nights when the quiet felt oppressive. When doubt crept in, not about what happened, but about whether the cost had been worth it. I replayed moments, searched for alternatives that might have hurt less. Not for her. For me. But grief isn't evidence of mistake. It's proof of investment. I stopped blaming myself for not seeing things sooner. Responsibility doesn't include predicting deception. It includes responding to it honestly once revealed. People eventually adjusted. So did I. The world didn't end. It recalibrated. I learned that clarity doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like standing alone with facts you didn't choose but refused to deny. It feels quieter than anger, heavier than relief. And it feels final. There was no satisfaction in watching rationalizations fail. Only a sober understanding that integrity costs something every time it's exercised. I paid that cost. And for the first time since this began, I accepted the loss without asking myself what I could have done differently. Some endings don't offer closure. They offer accuracy. And that, I found, was enough to move forward. Equals 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 equals. Rebuilding began quietly, without fanfare, and without illusions. I didn't seek to reclaim what had been lost: marriage, trust, the version of life I had once believed was permanent. Instead, I focused on defining what I would carry forward and what I would leave behind. I started with myself. My routines remained, but I revised their purpose. The morning coffee became a time to plan rather than escape. Work hours were respected, but no longer dictated my sense of identity. Evenings, once filled with small concessions to avoid conflict, became my own, reading, running, cooking meals that required no compromise or negotiation. My life was no longer a system calibrated around someone else's needs, and it felt heavier and lighter at the same time. Trust, I learned, is not something to give blindly, and it is not restored once fractured. It can only be rebuilt selectively and intentionally. I set boundaries with people and situations that had once blurred into assumed obligations. I answered questions carefully, maintained privacy, and stopped excusing behavior that once demanded explanation. I learned that clarity is stronger than hope when the hope is conditional on someone else's honesty. Friends returned slowly, some cautiously, others with relief. They no longer expected me to perform normalcy or minimize past pain. Conversations became honest, sometimes awkward, but grounded. Loneliness remained at times, but it was a conscious companion rather than a void imposed by betrayal. It reminded me of my independence and capacity for self-sufficiency. Emily reached out occasionally, brief messages framed in apology or explanation. I responded minimally or not at all. Forgiveness was not the goal, comprehension was. I needed no closure that required her participation. I understood her choices, her strategies, and her deceptions, and that understanding was enough. I did not forgive to ease my own discomfort. I observed, catalogued, and adjusted. I began setting new standards for myself and for relationships in general. Transparency, honesty, and mutual respect were non-negotiable. No compromise on integrity, no silence in the face of calculated manipulation. The past taught me that peace is only genuine when it is constructed on principles rather than avoidance. Financial independence, personal boundaries, and emotional clarity became pillars of this new life. Decisions were deliberate, not reactive. I pursued work projects with a renewed focus, taking calculated risks without fear of being manipulated or sidelined. I traveled, explored hobbies, and connected with people without allowing expectations of pretense to dictate engagement. Life was measured in choice, not obligation. Occasionally, memories of deception surfaced. I did not erase them. I reflected on them without self-reproach, without lingering resentment that consumed energy unnecessarily. Pain was acknowledged but compartmentalized, not romanticized. Each recollection reinforced a commitment to vigilance and self-respect. I discovered that rebuilding without illusion requires patience, honesty, and discipline. It requires rejecting victimhood, not denying harm. It requires defining a future according to one's own standards, not as a reaction to past betrayal. I was no longer trapped inside another person's narrative. I authored the terms of my own life. I did not seek love immediately. I did not rush to trust again. I did not need to. Stability and agency became my priorities. Clarity replaced comfort. Autonomy replaced compromise. And in that space, I found something rarer than romantic fulfillment, unshakable self-possession. Rebuilding, I realized, is not about restoring what broke, it is about refusing to live inside a lie. It is about creating a life where deception cannot define your boundaries, where choices are deliberate, and where honesty is the foundation, not an aspiration. And for the first time in years, I could breathe in a quiet home, awake in the morning, and feel secure in the life I had built entirely for myself.